Today we're going to be covering the second portion of the respiratory system lecture. In this portion of the lecture, we'll be talking about viral infections of the lower respiratory system, and then we'll finish up with fungal infections of the lower respiratory system. So first up, we have viral pneumonia, respiratory syncytial virus, and influenza. And don't worry, RSV is spelled out for you on a later slide. All right, so just how there are several different types of bacteria that can cause pneumonia when they get down in the lungs, there are also several different types of viruses that can cause pneumonia when they get down into the lungs. So influenza itself can cause a viral pneumonia, measles can cause viral pneumonia, and chickenpox. There are a few others that can cause viral pneumonia as well, but these are the three main causes. Vaccinations protect against all three of these, but there are some others that can contribute as well. Usually what happens when you present with symptoms of pneumonia, the clinician will suspect it's a virus when they do subsequent rounds of testing and they come up negative for bacteria, but you obviously have pneumonia. So that's when they go to, oh, if I can't find bacteria, but you have pneumonia, it must be caused by a virus. So that's usually how it works. All right, so second up, I guess, respiratory syncytial virus, or RSV. It's very common in infants. By the age of 2, most children are actually infected, but not everyone will show symptoms of having been infected. However, very small infants or those with compromised respiratory systems, so preemies are particularly at risk. People who are babies who have other respiratory issues, if they get RSV. So again, it only makes up a very small percentage of the total population, but if those very small preemies or with other respiratory issues, if they get RSV, it can result in a few thousand deaths annually, which is very sad. And again, because this is a virus, when you show up to the emergency room, your baby's in respiratory distress, antibiotics are not going to alleviate the symptoms because the root cause is a virus. They might try to give you steroids to try and open up the airways, but once the damage to the alveoli has happened, there's really not that much that can be done. So symptoms of respiratory syncytial virus, they're going to be pneumonia-like symptoms. So coughing, shortness of breath. On a chest x-ray, you would have fluid in the lungs, difficulty breathing, things like that. All right, now on to the big one, flu or influenza. The symptoms of influenza are chills, fever, headache, muscle aches. There are usually no GI symptoms associated with the flu. However, feelings of nausea can occur. People do die from influenza infections. There's a 1% mortality rate. Usually we see highest mortality rates in the very young and the very old populations. These are people with more susceptible immune systems. Most people, young adults, clear the initial symptoms of influenza in a few days, so about a week. Treatment, don't really worry about it other than to know you cannot treat the flu with antibiotics. They have to be antivirals, and they can really only be effective in certain scenarios, such as early detection. All right, so where was I? There is a multivalent vaccine available, the flu shot. Multivalent means that it covers multiple strains of the flu in one dose. So how the vaccine actually works is scientists come up with a prediction using a couple different factors, and they're trying to predict which strains of the flu they think will be most prevalent in the coming year. And so then those are the strains, those predicted strains are what make it into the vaccine. Sorry, let me just, respiratory. So the vaccines are not always going to cover 100% of the strains or be 100% effective, but the idea is that some protection is better than no protection when it comes to flu season. And flu season is upon us, so make sure you get your flu shots. All right. So just a little bit about the influenza virus itself. This is probably as in-depth as we're going to get with an individual virus. It is an RNA virus, so the genome that is within the virus is composed not of DNA, but this guy here is RNA segments. It has an inner protein layer, which is the capsid, and it has an outer lipid envelope it picks up from the host cell. So this is the envelope, this outer lipid layer here. On the outer surface of the virus, we have spikes, and there's two varieties we see here. The little blue triangles are H spikes or HA spikes, and then the green guys here are N spikes or NA spikes. H and N actually stand for much longer versions of the word. We have hemagglutinin and neuroarimidase, but you don't need to know those terms, so I chose to leave those off the slides. The function of these spikes is for attachment to the host cell and then release from the host cell. So we'll see in a second, it is possible to have different varieties of these H and N spikes, and so the different varieties are actually how we name the different influenza strains. So new strains do occur fairly regularly, and there is a process, a genetic process that is occurring with the influenza virus that allows for really very new strains to emerge, and that process is called antigenic shift. So antigenic shift are big changes in the viral surface spikes, so big changes in the hemagglutinin and neuroarimidase spikes, and those spikes, because they're on the outer surface, are what your immune system would detect and see. So if you can imagine you have, an antibody coming in, right? Antibodies are going to react to these H and N spikes. So for your immune system, the type of spikes a virus has plays an important role. So how this major shift in spikes occurs is through different strains of influenza co-infecting a cell at the same time, and then what emerges from that co-infected cell turns out to be different from either of the two original strains. And I'll post a video. Khan Academy goes into a really nice, brief explanation on antigenic shift and what's happening. So I'll post a video if you need additional clarification, and also your book goes into additional detail. The idea here is, again, the virus that emerges after this co-infection allows for it, because it's so different, it can avoid antibodies that have been generated from previous infections. So you might hear terms like H1N1. I feel like in the media now you don't really see these terms as much as you see swine flu or avian flu, or I think those are the two big ones, or bird flu, and they are just referring to different surface spikes. So this one has a type 3H spike and a type 2N spike, and that determines the type of viral strain that's found. In 1918, there was a really severe epidemic. Millions of people died across the globe. Several, I think it's something like 80 million people died, and several people in the Philadelphia area. So when H1N1 came back around a few years ago, maybe about 10 years ago, H1N1 was reported to be emerging again. There was a big public health kind of mobilization because, everyone should have been vaccinated. We were trying hard to get the word out because they were afraid it would have had a high virulence like previous H1N1 strains have had. So just a little bit more about the epidemic of 1918. So, somewhere between 20 to 50 million people died worldwide. That number's, it's a big range because record keeping in 1918 is not what it was today. What made this influenza strain different, so it was an H1N1 strain, was that the population that was primarily targeted and had the highest mortality rate was not a very young, like infants or elderly populations. It was young adults. And that was particularly devastating for populations because it's usually the adult portion of the population that's responsible for giving care to the extremes. So it was the fact that young adults had such a high mortality rate with this virus was very devastating. It didn't stay just as an upper respiratory infection. It actually got down into the lungs and resulted in lethal hemorrhaging. So again, bleeding into the lungs, it damages the tissue. You can't exchange gas, and you end up dying that way. Okay, so that was it for viral infections. Big ones there are RSV, or respiratory syncytial virus, and influenza. And, the reason why, so just going back real quick. So why antigenic shift and antigenic drift is another term you might hear. Why these two factors, why we mention it here. For most other viral infections, you can get away with maybe one inoculation when you're young and then maybe a booster, somewhere down the road. Why do I need a flu vaccine every year? The answer to that is the virus itself changes and mutates so rapidly that the strain you saw last year that you were immunized against is different enough from the new strain coming around that you're going to be susceptible again. So it's important every year to update your immunity to protect you against the new emerging strains of influenza. Not every virus can do antigenic shift, so not every, the measles virus is actually relatively stable. So, same thing with chickenpox. So the vaccine you got, several decades ago is actually still going to be fairly effective against the same strain of the virus that's floating around. So that's why we made a big deal out of that. Okay, and now fungal diseases of the respiratory system. I just want to start off by saying fungal diseases of the respiratory system are relatively rare because a fungus is so large and different from what your body is used to seeing. Your immune system is actually pretty good at readily clearing most of these fungal infections. So just keep that in mind, that the people who get fungal infections in the lungs usually have some sort of underlying respiratory issue or immune system issue that makes them more susceptible. Okay, so histoplasmosis is our first one. The name of the fungus that causes this infection is Histoplasma capsulatum. Dimorphic fungus, going all the way back to Unit 1. So fungi can take on two forms. They can be yeast-like, so these guys are circles, right? So you see they're kind of budding. Right, so it's let me just try to erase that real quick. Erase. So let me just use the laser pointer, I guess. So you see it's a circle, right, with a little bud coming off. This is how yeast look, and this is how yeast reproduce. So this is one possible shape for a fungus to take place. And then another type or shape a fungus can have is this branching shape with, you see these long fibers here, microspores. So usually in the body they have a yeast-like form, so think about yeast in the heat, and then hyphae in the cold. Hyphae is another term for these branching structures. So dimorphic just means that it can kind of go between these two forms, and usually in the body it's this one, and in colder situations, less favorable, it's the second shape. So dimorphic, two shapes. So there you go. All right, symptoms of this fungal infection in the lungs. So histoplasmosis. It's actually very similar to tuberculosis. So coughing, usually non-productive, so not a lot of mucus with it. Weight loss over a long period of time. General malaise, flu-like symptoms, and then on a chest x-ray, I may be able to see a mass or a shadow in the lungs. However, if I were to give this person a tuberculin skin test, they would test negative, right? So So there you go. So talking about the skin test again for tuberculosis. So it is possible to have a positive tuberculin skin test. Like let's say this person was born outside of the U.S. and they received a vaccine. And let's say they have a shadow in the lungs. And it's not just fungal infections or tuberculosis that can cause masses to appear on a chest x-ray. You could also have certain types of cancer. So just because you have a positive chest x-ray doesn't definitely mean you have tuberculosis. And just because you have a positive skin test doesn't definitely mean you have active tuberculosis. So that's why you need to culture and do additional testing to identify active tuberculosis. But talking about histoplasmosis, so again, the skin test would be negative, assuming you have not had previous exposure, but you would be able to see a mass of the fungal growth in the lungs. And how you're exposed, so basically chickens and bats can carry histoplasmosis in the fungus in their digestive tracts, and then, right, because they're picking it up from the soil. And then as they leave their droppings, the droppings dry out, and then you can inhale them that way. So we see people who have a lot of farm exposure, becoming positive for histoplasmosis. And I guess if you were to go in a cave that had bats, you could also be exposed that way. But most human exposures are chicken. All right, we do have cases that pop up in our area. It's more rural areas that would have histoplasmosis, so again, more farming areas. Okay, another type of fungal infection that can make it into the lungs is Coccidioides immitis, and the name of the condition that results when this fungus gets in the lungs is Coccidioides mycosis, and mycosis is referring to the fungal infection. It, again, is another dimorphic fungus, so in the body, and it takes on the yeast shape. And then in the environment and soil, it would have the branching shape. Usually in the dry soils of the Southwest is where we find the soil testing positive for the fungus. And so if you go out there and you have, let's say you're a smoker, it is possible to pick up this fungus. Fever, coughing, weight loss. So kind of non-specific symptoms. And I have a funny personal story to share with you. So I had one of my friends, their mother went out to Arizona to be in the desert on like this nice vacation, and the mother was a heavy smoker. So she came back, and a few weeks later she's been not feeling well, coughing. She had some weight loss, and so she went to the doctors, and they took a chest x-ray, and they found a mass in her lungs. And because she's a smoker, she assumed it was lung cancer. So she decided to give away all of her possessions because she thought she was dying, like her television, her couch. And and it turns out on further testing that they're like, oh my gosh, it's not lung cancer. You have a fungal growth in your lungs. You probably picked it up when you went to Arizona. We'll give you this antifungal medication and you'll be fine. And so then it was a really big struggle for her to get all of the furniture and stuff back that she had sold from the people, because now she's like, I'm not dying. Anyways, but the good news is she did end up quitting smoking because she was of that scare. So that was good, I guess. All right. So the life cycle of Coccidioides, I wouldn't focus too much on this. This is just showing, again, the two kind of phases, the branching and bulbing, but I wouldn't focus on that hardly at all. Pneumocystis jirovecii. This is a fungal infection that we see specifically in patients with AIDS. So you had HIV, and then it progressed to full-blown AIDS. So your immune system is pretty much non-functional at this point, and these patients turn out to be very susceptible to a very specific type of fungal lung infection, pneumocystis. We're not really sure where they're picking it up from, somewhere in the environment. Soil is probably the most common, and it presents as a type of pneumonia, but because it's a fungal infection, it's not going to respond to initial antibiotics, and it's actually very hard to clear if you don't have a functioning immune system. So some portion of AIDS patients actually end up passing away from this really aggressive type of pneumonia. And then we have aspergillosis is another type of fungal infection. Compost piles usually test positive for this. Again, most of us, if we're exposed to this fungus, are able to clear it. It's not going to cause any problems for our lungs. However, if you do have a poor functioning immune system, an immune system that's not top-notch, a couple of things that might lead to that. So AIDS, cancer treatments, certain uncontrolled diabetes may affect your immune system enough where you would be exposed to this, inhale it, your immune system wouldn't be able to clear it, and then you would end up with a pneumonia caused by this fungus. All right. So don't worry about this. I'm not gonna ask you. It was for a discussion. All right, and that's it. You made it. So, all right, focusing a lot on influenza because that's a big one, especially in terms of our modern healthcare system. Influenza is a huge illness that pops up every year. And just as a reminder, there will be a quiz due before next class on Tuesday covering both of the respiratory system lectures. All right, so good luck. And if you have any questions, please email.